Hey guys, tonight we're going to step into the shoes of medieval monarchs. And trust me, you probably wouldn't survive this. Picture yourself surrounded by walls of stone, heavy tapestries adorning the halls, the faint flicker of candlelight casting long shadows. The air is cool, but you're sweating, your heart racing, because every sound, every whisper could be a threat. This was the reality for medieval kings and queens. They lived with the constant fear that someone somewhere might be plotting their demise. Now, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from, so drop a comment with your location and the local time. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Being a monarch in medieval times wasn't all golden crowns and lavish feasts. It was an endless struggle for survival. You might think a king or queen had it made, sitting in a throne room surrounded by wealth and servants, never having to worry about anything more than what to have for dinner. But in reality, a royal's sleep was far from peaceful. They had to sleep with one eye open, not out of choice, but out of necessity. The threat of assassination loomed large at all times. You see, medieval politics weren't just about diplomacy and alliances. They were about power, and power meant constant danger. It was like a high-stakes game of musical chairs, with the throne as the prize. One wrong move, one misplaced word, and your life could be snuffed out by someone you thought you could trust. Remember that feeling you get when you hear something strange at night, and your senses go on high alert? That's the baseline of medieval royal life. Historians still debate whether it was the sheer volume of enemies or the unpredictable nature of court politics that kept these monarchs on edge. But it's clear, sleeping peacefully was a luxury they couldn't afford. The dangers weren't just confined to the borders of a kingdom. No, the real threats lurk much closer to home. In the world of medieval monarchs, one of the most dangerous things you could do was trust someone, especially those in your own court. Monarchs were often surrounded by a web of people eager to see them fall. And these weren't always foreign enemies. In fact, some of the deadliest plots came from within the very walls of the royal palace. You know how you sometimes hear about a friend who's a little too eager to gain favor, the kind of person who'll smile while stabbing you in the back. Well, multiply that by 1,000 and place it in the tense environment of a medieval court, and you've got a real recipe for disaster. In fact, trust was such a rare commodity that monarchs had to develop their own methods for navigating the treacherous waters of royal politics. It was all about who you knew, and more importantly, who you could not trust. The notion of sleeping with one eye open wasn't just a metaphor. It was a reality. Picture this. You're a monarch, lying in your grand bed, surrounded by silken sheets, but the peace and comfort are just a facade. You've got to sleep, yes, but there's a nagging sense that someone, maybe even someone close to you, could slip in at any moment and end it all. Could be a trusted advisor, a relative, or one of your guards. Trust was in short supply. Historians still argue whether the paranoia was justified or simply a reflection of the times. But one thing's certain. Medieval monarchs never felt safe. Not even in their own beds. Intrigues and conspiracies were constant threats, and being a ruler meant dealing with these everyday risks. You didn't just have to worry about external threats like invading armies. You had to watch your back from the inside too. Assassination was the most extreme form of betrayal, but it wasn't as uncommon as one might hope. In fact, during the medieval period, political murder became a sort of extreme measure for resolving disputes or securing power. Kings and queens were no more immune to this fate than any commoner when it came to courtly politics. The most famous example, of course, is the assassination of King Henry II of England, where a conspiracy between his sons and several members of his court led to his brutal demise. But even before the rise of such dramatic acts, assassination was a common tool for those in the royal circle. Imagine for a second, you're the monarch. You're sitting in your private chambers, perhaps reading a report or planning the next day's affairs. You've already had dinner, but there's a constant tension in the air, a slight but ever-present hum of unease. You look around, not just at your servants or courtiers, but at every person in your court with a new sense of suspicion. Could someone be plotting against you, right under your nose? The fear of assassination was so pervasive that some monarchs developed elaborate schemes to protect themselves while they slept. We're talking about secret passageways, hidden chambers, and even sleeping with a personal guard on constant watch. Some monarchs would place their beds in locations that were as far away from doors or windows as possible. Others employed elaborate decoys, sleeping in different chambers at night to confuse any would-be attackers. Historians still argue whether these measures were enough to protect a monarch, or if they merely prolonged the inevitable. Still, the fear of assassination lingered throughout the medieval period. Even if a monarch trusted their guards or close allies, there was always the unsettling thought that someone might want to take that crown for themselves. So, instead of a peaceful night's rest, kings and queens had to settle for restless sleep, always wondering who might be after them next. Now, we need to address a question that's been lingering. Did medieval monarchs literally sleep with one eye open? The phrase, sleeping with one eye open, is often used metaphorically to describe a state of constant vigilance and distrust. But did they actually sleep this way, in the literal sense? After all, nobody could be alert every moment, could they? Well, it turns out, it wasn't entirely metaphorical. While there are no historical records suggesting that monarchs literally slept with an eye open, many of them took extensive precautions to ensure their safety while they slept. And this wasn't just about having a guard posted outside the door. No, these royal measures were often far more elaborate than that. Take, for instance, the practice of sleeping with guards in the same room. Yes, some kings and queens had their personal guards positioned near their beds, sometimes within arm's reach. This was to ensure that if anyone did try to sneak in, the monarch could be alerted almost immediately. The idea of sleeping in the presence of armed men must have been an unsettling thought for many monarchs, but it is also seen as a necessary measure of protection. Historians still argue whether these guards were a sign of genuine threat or just a symbolic gesture. Were these guards genuinely effective, or were they just part of a larger royal image, one that projected a sense of security and control? The reality likely lies somewhere in between. While guards may have been a deterrent, they were also a constant reminder that the throne wasn't as secure as it seemed. In addition to having guards near their beds, some monarchs took additional steps like sleeping with hidden weapons or even elaborate alarm systems. Some castles had rooms with trapdoors and secret passageways that could allow the king or queen to escape quickly if necessary. Though these measures may seem extreme, in a world where betrayal was common and assassination was a tool for power, the more precautions you took, the more likely you were to survive the night. As we've seen, medieval monarchs lived in constant fear of assassination or betrayal. But there was another, perhaps more subtle threat that haunted them: court intrigue. This wasn't just about external enemies plotting in the shadows. It was about the power struggles that played out within their very own courts. To be a monarch meant dealing with ambitious courtiers, scheming nobles, and even jealous family members, all vying for a slice of power or a path to the throne. These internal threats could be even more dangerous than foreign enemies. In the medieval period, noble families often had as much, if not more, power than the monarchs themselves. And it was not unusual for close relatives, such as siblings, uncles, or even sons, to challenge the reigning monarch for the throne. The constant threat of a coup or a royal rival was just one of the many factors that kept medieval monarchs up at night. For example, look at King Richard II of England, who was overthrown in a coup led by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who would later become Henry IV. Richard's own cousin, once a close confidant, turned on him and took the crown. That's the kind of betrayal that could make anyone reconsider the wisdom of trusting anyone, even family. It wasn't just power-hungry nobles or rivals who were dangerous. Sometimes, it was our own blood. Historians still debate whether the atmosphere of constant tension and competition within the royal family helped to foster such betrayals, or if it was simply the nature of medieval politics. Some argue that monarchs who had fewer strong rivals within their family tended to have more stable reigns. Others believe that even the most trusted family members were always looking for an opportunity to seize the crown. No matter the cause, the reality for monarchs was clear. Every family member, every trusted advisor, and every noble in their court could be a potential threat, especially when the throne was at stake. The result? Even more vigilance. Every monarch had to keep their family close, but also be wary. Trust was no longer a given, and even the most familial of relationships were often tainted by the potential for power grabs. A royal's very own family could, and often did, become the source of their greatest threats. But let's take a step back for a moment and consider something else. Not all threats to a monarch's safety came in the form of menacing plots or bitter rivalries. Sometimes the danger was far more subtle, often creeping up at the most unexpected times. Monarchs, even in the medieval era, had to consider the nature of their own surroundings. Poison, for instance, was a powerful tool of assassination that required no visible weapon, no loud confrontation. It was insidious, creeping into their daily lives in ways they couldn't easily detect. Imagine yourself as a medieval monarch. You've just finished a grand banquet, perhaps a feast in your honor, and now you're enjoying a quiet moment with your closest allies. But not everyone at the table is your ally. One of your trusted officials, perhaps even a servant, could be slipping poison into your cup while you're distracted by a conversation. There's no screaming, no battle, just the slow, deadly onset of a carefully calculated plan to end your life. This wasn't a far-off fantasy, it was reality. Poison was a favored weapon in the medieval world, and it is remarkably easy to slip into someone's food or drink without leaving a trace. In fact, certain poisons, like arsenic or hemlock, were used so often that they became the go-to method for eliminating inconvenient royals or rivals. And unlike stabbing or strangling, poison could be administered without even having to come into close contact with the victim. Historians still debate how frequently poisoning actually occurred in medieval courts. Some believe that the fear of poison was largely exaggerated, the stuff of rumors and royal paranoia. Others point out that monarchs who died under mysterious circumstances often had few visible wounds or signs of injury, leading to widespread suspicions of poisoning. But one thing is certain, the threat was ever present. Every meal, every drink, even every bite of food had to be approached with caution. Monarchs developed various countermeasures to protect themselves from this silent threat. Some had food testers, trusted servants who tasted their food before they did, ensuring that no one had slipped anything dangerous into their meal. Others carried personal cupbearers, individuals who were constantly at their side, ensuring their drinks were safe. Yet, despite all these precautions, there was always that lingering possibility. Could someone be trying to poison you as you sipped your wine? Of course, not all threats to a monarch's safety came in the form of covert assassinations or poisoned goblets. In fact, one of the most dangerous times for any medieval ruler was when they ventured outside the walls of their castle. Whether it was for a royal procession, a diplomatic meeting, or even a hunt, castles provided a certain degree of security and familiarity. But stepping beyond those stone walls meant entering a world where every person you met could potentially pose a threat. Take the example of King Henry II of England once again. In 1174, he went on a journey to Scotland to quell a rebellion. It was a routine military operation for a monarch who had been in power for decades, but it ended up being anything but ordinary. Henry's army was ambushed, and his safety was almost compromised. If he hadn't been escorted by his loyal guards, it's easy to imagine how quickly the entire situation could have turned deadly. The idea of a monarch traveling through hostile or even unfamiliar territories wasn't just a logistical challenge. It was a very real safety concern. It wasn't like today, where you can hop on a plane and zoom around the world in comfort and safety. Back then, monarchs had to contend with the very real possibility of being captured or assassinated during their travels. And when they weren't on the move, their courtiers and advisors often had to keep an eye out for any signs of rebellion, sabotage, or defection among their own troops. Historians still debate how often rulers put themselves in these vulnerable situations willingly, or whether they did so out of necessity. Some argue that the travels of monarchs were often more about asserting power, displaying strength, and reminding subjects of their authority. Others suggest that travel was less about show and more about survival. Kings and queens often traveled to maintain control over their territories, as well as to reinforce alliances and quell unrest. The road, as it were, was both an opportunity for diplomacy and an invitation for danger. Beyond the physical dangers of travel, the very act of being away from the safety of one's castle meant exposing oneself to risks from multiple angles. Any number of things could go wrong, whether it was an ambush from a rival faction or a local rebellion erupting in a town that the monarch had just visited. As a monarch, The world outside your castle walls wasn't the only dangerous place. The very throne you sat upon, the gilded seat of power, could also be a source of peril. Medieval thrones were not merely symbols of authority. They were physical locations that demanded protection, for they could easily become the focus of revolt. The sheer amount of power that a monarch wielded made their presence a magnet for danger, especially when they were in their courts surrounded by enemies both visible and hidden. Let's take a look at the throne room itself. These rooms, designed to impress and overwhelm, were also battlegrounds in their own right. They were crowded with courtiers, lords, and knights, all vying for attention, influence, and position. In this world of intrigue, no monarch was ever truly alone. Every decision, every gesture could be observed and interpreted by those around them, leading to alliances, rivalries, and threats that could shift with the slightest change in the political winds. But even more than the drama of court life, the threat within these spaces was tangible. Assassins often preferred to strike when a monarch was seated upon their throne, symbolizing the very pinnacle of their rule. Imagine sitting there, hearing the voices of your closest advisors as they approach with reports on the day's matters, your mind swirling with decisions, only to realize that some of those voices belong to people who might want to end your reign. Take, for instance, the shocking assassination of King Charles I of England in 1649. The execution, a public affair, was not just a moment of royal downfall. It was a political statement. Charles had been betrayed not only by his enemies, but also by factions within his own court who had grown disillusioned with his rule. Even though he might have trusted some of these people, when push came to shove, it was the cold steel of an executioner's axe that sealed his fate. Historians still argue over whether the monarch's throne room was more of a dangerous space because of the visible threat of rebellion, or whether it was more due to the constant manipulation and intrigue going on behind closed doors. Some say that those around the monarch were the ones who posed the greatest danger. Others believe that monarchs became complacent, trusting too deeply in their own power and therefore never truly expecting to be betrayed. Regardless, the atmosphere of distrust in these royal spaces was palpable, and it added another layer of tension to a monarch's already perilous existence. As we continue down this winding road of medieval royal danger, it's time to discuss something that might seem a bit unusual at first: royal sleep habits. When we think of monarchs and their need for protection, we tend to focus on the grand political schemes, the betrayals, and the assassinations. But in reality, one of the more subtle, yet very significant threats a monarch faced was the simple act of falling asleep. After all, a monarch's slumber wasn't just about rest, it was about survival. And sleep, in the medieval era, was anything but peaceful. Let's think about it. In a world where every whispered conversation could be a plot to take your life, even the act of closing your eyes could be dangerous. Monarchs couldn't afford to sleep soundly in the way we do today. Their minds were constantly working, analyzing, and scanning for threats, even in the quiet hours of the night. Some kings and queens took their personal security to such extremes that they would sleep in small, cramped rooms, surrounded by trusted guards or even members of their court. And the bed itself, it wasn't just a place to sleep. It was often heavily guarded, a strategic position to ensure that the monarch was as safe as possible. Historians still debate the level of paranoia that ruled a monarch's nightly routine. Some suggest that the rituals of royal sleep, including having attendants or guards within the bedroom, were merely a precautionary measure, a way to provide comfort and security. Others, however, believe that these precautions were a direct reflection of how dangerous life truly was for a medieval ruler. After all, in a world where your very survival could be compromised by a fleeting moment of vulnerability, the idea of trusting even the walls around you becomes a luxury you simply couldn't afford. And it wasn't just the physical security that kept these monarchs awake. It was also the ever-present worry about betrayal. Even in their most private moments, they couldn't escape the knowledge that some of the people they trusted the most were the very ones who might have designs on their crown. That gnawing fear was like a shadow, never truly leaving them, even in sleep. As we peer deeper into the nocturnal lives of medieval monarchs, we encounter another curious but important aspect of their reigns: the use of nighttime security measures. It's hard to imagine, but a good portion of a medieval monarch's day wasn't simply about running a kingdom. It was about staying alive. As kings and queens tried to ensure their safety, some went to lengths that seem almost comical by today's standards. But in their world, these precautions were a matter of life or death. Take, for example, the infamous practice of sleeping with one eye open. This wasn't just a metaphor. Monarchs were known to sleep in a sort of half-conscious state, with one eye partially open, ready to spring into action at the slightest sign of trouble. The most extreme versions of this included having a bed guard, a trusted knight or bodyguard, who stood watch while the monarch rested. And it wasn't just a matter of having a person stationed outside the door. Sometimes, monarchs even had secret passages, hidden exits, or concealed rooms, so that if something went awry, they had a way to escape undetected. Historians still argue about how common this practice was. Some sources suggest that it was largely a myth, perpetuated by the stories of paranoid rulers who were more concerned with the appearance of security than actual danger. Others point to specific examples, like King Henry VIII, who had an entourage of servants and knights who would stand guard while he slept. The goal wasn't necessarily to prevent assassination, but to ensure that, should a plot be unfolding, the monarch had a chance to escape before it was too late. But it wasn't just the physical arrangements that kept monarchs on edge during the night. The sheer knowledge that danger could strike at any moment turned sleep into a strategic, vulnerable act. Even when surrounded by guards and walls, a monarch was still aware that the peace they enjoyed could be shattered in an instant. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint sound in the corridor, could be the harbinger of something far worse. As we look back at the stories of these sleep-deprived rulers, one thing becomes clear. These monarchs lived in a constant state of high alert. The night, which for most of us is a time for rest and renewal, was for them a time of anxiety and heightened caution. Even with their castles, guards, and elaborate systems in place, the very act of sleeping was a reminder of just how fragile their reigns were. It's easy to picture these medieval monarchs as hyper-vigilant figures, always alert and ever watchful. But one of the more peculiar aspects of royal security was that it wasn't just about the presence of guards or elaborate security measures. It was also about how the monarch chose to manage their relationships with those closest to them. In a world dominated by distrust and potential betrayal, even a monarch's personal inner circle could be the most dangerous place to be. Imagine this. You are a medieval monarch, sitting in your great hall surrounded by your closest advisors. These are the people you've known for years, people who are supposed to have your back. But in reality, some of them are just waiting for an opportunity to take your crown. The real danger didn't necessarily come from enemy kings or foreign invaders. It often came from within the court itself. Courtiers, princes, and even family members were constantly plotting to enhance their own power, sometimes at the cost of the monarch's life. Consider the story of King Richard II of England. In 1399, he was betrayed by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who would later become Henry IV. Bolingbroke's ambition and resentment toward Richard's reign were well known, but the level of deceit and manipulation within the royal family was far more complex than it first appeared. Richard's own circle of advisors and friends turned on him, making his situation even more precarious. Despite being surrounded by trusted individuals, Richard's reign ended abruptly when Bolingbroke seized power, capturing Richard and ultimately imprisoning him. Historians still debate whether Richard truly trusted the people closest to him, or whether his downfall was simply a result of his inability to recognize the ever-present threat from those around him. Some scholars argue that Richard was naive, perhaps too eager to believe that his inner circle shared his vision. Others believe he was aware of the risks but chose to focus on other aspects of governance, trusting his advisors to carry out their duties. Either way, Richard's downfall proves just how dangerous it could be to trust those around you when you held such absolute power. Monarchs had to constantly weigh the risk of betrayal in every relationship, from family members to longtime friends. The people who were closest to them were often the most dangerous, and sometimes a monarch would only realize the betrayal too late. The real tragedy wasn't just the loss of power. It was the fact that, despite all the precautions, monarchs could never truly escape the constant threat of treachery. Now let's shift gears slightly and think about the grandiose nature of a monarch's lifestyle. While it's tempting to view these rulers as impervious figures, their luxurious surroundings and lavishness were often paradoxical. In a world where their security was never guaranteed, they lived surrounded by opulence that also made them even more vulnerable. The very treasures and symbols of their power that adorned their palaces and courts often became a source of danger. The medieval monarch's palace, filled with rich tapestries, golden goblets, and delicate jewels, wasn't just a sign of wealth. It was also a target. Treasures meant to signal a ruler's greatness also had a tendency to draw envy and greed from all directions. And this wasn't just about foreign invaders or rebellious peasants. There was a constant internal danger from those who would stop at nothing to get their hands on a piece of the royal fortune. Take, for example, the tale of the infamous Medici family in Renaissance Italy. Though this isn't quite medieval, their rule provides an interesting parallel. The Medici were known for their extravagant lifestyle, and their wealth attracted both admiration and animosity. In the case of Lorenzo de' Medici, the wealth and power of his family made him a target. His opulent lifestyle was mirrored by constant intrigue and conspiracy within Florence. In one such instance, he narrowly escaped an assassination attempt while attending Mass. This event serves as a reminder that wealth and power didn't just come with prestige, they came with a constant looming threat from both within and outside the walls. But back to medieval monarchs. These rulers, too, had to be cautious of the very material wealth they displayed. Gold, silver, and rare objects that symbolized their reign were often stashed in vaults or hidden within the castle's walls. The mere knowledge that such riches existed in the royal chambers only fueled the greed of potential conspirators. Wealth wasn't just a symbol of success. It was a beacon for anyone with nefarious plans. Historians still argue whether the riches of a monarch made them more secure or more vulnerable. Some believe that it was the opulence of their courts that acted as a shield, a status that demanded respect and deterred outright violence. Others argue that the riches were a magnet for betrayal and assassination. It seems that no matter what angle you look at it from, the lavishness of a monarch's lifestyle was a double-edged sword. While it may have solidified their position in the short term, it also made them a constant target in a world where trust was in short supply. As we delve deeper into the intricacies of royal paranoia, we can't ignore one of the more fascinating and often overlooked aspects of medieval royal life: the sheer number of spies employed to keep monarchs informed of everything happening within their kingdoms. In an age without modern surveillance technology, spies were an essential part of the political landscape, and no royal court was complete without a network of informants, both inside and outside the kingdom. The most interesting thing about these spies was that they often weren't the cloaked, shadowy figures we might imagine. In fact, many of them were trusted members of the court, family, or even foreign diplomats who pretended to be loyal allies while secretly gathering intelligence for rival monarchs or power-hungry factions. Imagine living in a palace where your closest confidants could be spying on you, reporting back to someone who wanted to see you replaced. That constant threat of betrayal meant that even the most private conversations could be compromised. Take, for example, the famous case of the English court in the 16th century. Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, was no stranger to plots against her life. To protect herself, she employed a wide-ranging network of spies, known as the Intelligence Network, run by her trusted spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham. This network wasn't just concerned with foreign threats. It was also focused on uncovering any potential discontent or rebellion within the English court. Members of her own court, including her closest advisors, were regularly monitored to ensure they were not secretly conspiring with rivals, such as the Catholic factions that sought to dethrone her. Historians often debate how much Elizabeth truly trusted her spies. Some suggest that Elizabeth was extremely cautious and kept a tight hold on her intelligence network, keeping close tabs on everyone around her, even her most trusted allies. Others argue that Elizabeth was somewhat naive, relying too heavily on her informants and occasionally overlooking the potential for betrayal among the very people she believed were loyal. One thing is certain, though: these spies were an essential part of the royal survival strategy. Without them, it's likely that many monarchs wouldn't have lasted nearly as long as they did. The sheer volume of espionage that went on in the courts of medieval monarchs would likely be shocking to us today. The paranoia was so intense that it was almost impossible to know who could be trusted, and even the act of sharing a secret could result in deadly consequences. The presence of spies and informants ensured that rulers could never truly relax, knowing that their every word and action was being monitored. By now, you're probably starting to realize that medieval monarchs didn't exactly have the peaceful, serene lives that many would assume. Even with their castles, wealth, and entourages, they were constantly surrounded by danger, both from within their courts and from outside forces. But there was one more factor that added a level of stress and anxiety to their already complicated lives: the question of succession. In the medieval world, a monarch's reign wasn't just about personal survival. It was about ensuring the survival of their family line. If a king or queen didn't produce a viable heir, it wasn't just their throne that was at risk. It was the future of the entire dynasty. The pressure to produce an heir was immense, and it could often lead to decisions that seemed ludicrous or outright dangerous by modern standards. Take, for example, the case of King Henry VIII of England. His quest for a male heir dominated his reign, and his desperate attempts to secure one were nothing short of dramatic. From his 6 marriages to his eventual break with the Catholic Church over his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, Henry's obsession with producing a male heir led to some of the most infamous moments in English history. Despite his efforts, it wasn't until his third wife, Jane Seymour, bore him a son, Edward VI, that his obsession was somewhat satisfied. But the dangers of his quest didn't end there. The birth of Edward didn't bring an end to court intrigue. In fact, Henry's obsession with securing a stable line of succession led to the brutal execution of his wives and a near-constant state of turmoil within his court. Historians still debate the extent to which Henry's focus on succession clouded his judgment. Some argue that his obsession with producing a male heir was the root cause of much of the violence and political instability during his reign. Others suggest that it was his inability to recognize the political and personal stakes involved in the succession crisis that led to the turmoil. In either case, the pressure of ensuring a monarch's legacy often led to a level of anxiety and instability that only made it harder to enjoy the luxury and power that came with the crown. In other regions, monarchs faced similar challenges. The rulers of the Byzantine Empire, for instance, were regularly embroiled in succession struggles. Emperors had to be not only vigilant against assassinations, but also wary of those within their own families who might seek to undermine their position for a shot at the throne. The Byzantine throne was often passed down through violent and complicated means. Assassinations, betrayals, and palace coups were a frequent occurrence. In fact, historians argue that the sheer number of usurpations in Byzantine history was so high that it became almost impossible for any ruler to relax, even within the safety of their own palace walls. As we draw the final curtain on tonight's exploration of the paranoid lives of medieval monarchs, it's clear that their reigns were anything but easy. From the constant threat of betrayal by those closest to them to the stress of keeping a kingdom secure while surrounded by luxury and wealth, their lives were marked by an unyielding tension that most of us can only imagine. Yet through it all, these monarchs held onto their thrones, often by the skin of their teeth, navigating a world where danger was omnipresent and loyalty was a rare commodity. In many ways, the medieval kings and queens were trapped by their own grandeur, surrounded by both the riches and the responsibilities of their stations. The intrigues, the spies, the constant need for vigilance, It was a never-ending cycle that tested not just their physical fortitude, but their mental resilience. Many may have lived in palaces, but in truth, they were often prisoners within those walls, constantly watching their backs, never able to truly relax. And yet, as history marches forward, it's this very paranoia and the lengths to which these monarchs went to protect themselves that have left us with some of the most fascinating stories and dramatic turns in the annals of history. Despite the betrayal, the scheming, and the relentless pursuit of power, many of these rulers managed to hold on to their crowns, sometimes only by the smallest of margins. Now, as you settle into your blankets and let the history of these medieval rulers fade into the past, remember that even the mightiest of kings and queens weren't immune to the shadows lurking just beyond their royal walls. There's a certain peace in knowing that perhaps we are not so different from them after all. We all have our own kingdoms to protect, our own worries to face. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, know that the world of these rulers, though distant in time, is always just a whisper away, waiting for you to discover the quiet, hidden stories that lie beneath the surface. The lesson here, of course, is that even in the grandest castles, the highest thrones, there's always a shadow, watching, waiting,